Hello, I'm Tamar Gendler. I'm professor of philosophy and cognitive science at Yale University.
I'm Andrew Solomon, and I'm the author of Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity.
And today on the Mind Report, we'll be discussing Andrew's incredible new book, Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. So, Andrew, I spent Thanksgiving vacation immersed in your book, living in the world that you apparently inhabited for a decade in the process of putting this book together. And I was so taken by this book that I've spent much of the last 10 days proselytizing to everybody I see about how wonderful the book is, and was pleased to be confirmed in my judgment when I assigned the book to one of my classes. I assigned excerpts from the book and received for the first time in my life thank you notes from students for having asked them to do the reading. So what I want to start by doing is to ask you to say a few words about the architectural framework that structures the book, this idea of the contrast between vertical and horizontal identities. And then we can talk about some of the more specific aspects of the book.
So I started the book with the idea that there are essentially many identities, which I've called vertical identities, which are passed down generationally from parent to child. So one's ethnicity, for example, is an identity one shares in common with one's progenitors. One's nationality in general, immigrants notwithstanding, one's language. There are many things that one always has, or usually at least has in common with one's parents, and I've alluded to those as vertical identities. But there are other forms of identity which have to essentially be learned from a peer group. So most gay children are born to straight parents, for example, and most people who are deaf are actually born to hearing parents, and most dwarfs are born to parents of average height, and so on and so forth. And it struck me that the vertical identities, the ones that are passed down generationally, are usually reinforced from an early age. So one could argue that it's difficult, the post-racial presidency notwithstanding, to be African American in the United States as it's currently constructed. But families of people who are African American are not in general trying to do research to figure out how to cause the next generation to come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. The horizontal identities, on the other hand, these ones that are learned from a peer group and that are alien to parents, are usually not only alien to those parents, but also alienating to those parents. And the natural response of those parents is often to try to alter those identities. So, time out of mind, parents of gay kids have tried to make them straight because they think that's an easier, better, happier way to be in the world. Maybe for moral reasons, maybe as a reflection of social challenges. Parents who are hearing and have deaf children have by and large wanted those children to focus on lip reading and oral speech on grounds that that would allow them to function in the so-called real world. Parents of many other kinds of children who differ from them dramatically have focused on ways to integrate those children into what they think of as mainstream reality and what is clearly their reality. So I was interested then in looking at the idea that the civil rights of people who have vertical identities came first. The women's movement, the civil rights movement, other movements in which whole families were trying to be accepted for who they are. And these other identities, these ones which families themselves tend to try to cure or to rectify or to alter, had to wait until the previous lot of identities had received their imprimatur from the larger society before they began their own struggle for rights.
So, to my mind, there are two paradigmatic cases that have all of the features that you've identified in the book. So I should tell the readers who haven't encountered the book that the structure of the book is to explore 10 instances of this general structure, which Andrew have just described. That is to look at identities of children born to typical parents so identities of children who are deaf, who are dwarves, who have Down syndrome, who have autism, who are schizophrenic, who have disabilities, who are prodigies, who are children born of rape, children who grow up to be criminals, and then in the final chapter, children who are transgender. So of the 10 identities that are explored in the book, the first two, deafness and dwarfism, seem to have a kind of paradigmatic structure of the following kind. It is the case both that the condition is medicalized vertically, that is, that the initial response in many cases of parents of children born with these conditions is to see the condition as problematic and to seek ways to intervene and to cause the child to grow up in a way where the condition is least manifest. But that with respect to the horizontal community, the community of deaf people and the community of little people, there is a valorization of the identity. There's a sense in which that identity provides an alternative equilibrium that allows most of the things that the larger society takes to be essential to flourishing to take place just in a different way. So I wondered if you could say a bit, both in the case of deafness and in the case of dwarfism, about the ways in which communities have been developed around those alternative equilibria.
So I think I'll begin in response to that by saying that those are the two chapters with which the book begins, not only in the order of the table of contents, but also in the order of my own engagement with it and my own writing of the book. Almost 20 years ago, I received an assignment from the New York Times Magazine to write about deaf culture. And I was rather taken aback when I got the assignment. I was doing mostly foreign reporting at the time. And my editor said to me, "This seems to be a foreign culture within our own country." And when I went into the deaf world, I started off with the usual position that deafness seemed like a deficit. Those poor people, what a shame they can't hear. I wonder what we can do for them. And then I went out and I began meeting people who were members of this deaf culture. And I discovered that for many of them, deafness was, in effect, its own ethnicity. It was its own linguistic culture. It was organized around the use of sign language. I found that the deaf people whom I met had a real sense that they were not people who were lacking in hearing, but rather people who had membership in a rich and vital world. And I found out about deaf theater and deaf poetry. I went to deaf clubs. I went to the Miss Deaf America contest. It was this very coherent, intact culture. But it turned out that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and that those parents, unsurprisingly really, have got a sense as they go along that these children are being cut off from what they think of as the real world, the world of hearing. The deaf culture has achieved more and more recognition out in the world. Sign language is now, I think, the 5th most frequently taught language on American college campuses. At the same time that deaf culture has been coming into its own, medical progress has been being made, and the advent of the cochlear implant, which gives people some effective facsimile of hearing, means that people who are deaf have increasingly the possibility of being cured, as it were, or their situation has been resolved. And I felt as I went along that there was a conflict between the social model, which was a model of culture, a model of increasing acceptance, a model even of celebration of the accomplishments of the deaf world, was in a kind of dramatic conflict with the medical model, which was the model of illness and cure and of rectifying the condition. And it reminded me in a way of those operas at the end of which the hero realizes he loves the heroine right as she expires on the divan center stage. And that was what was happening within deafness. And I understood the position of parents who wanted to cure their children's deafness. I certainly, before I did this work, if I had had a child who was deaf, I would not have given it 3 minutes of thought. I would have gone and had a cochlear implant so that my child would be able to function in the hearing world. And actually, even now, even having engaged with the richness of deaf culture, I think there are many arguments to be made in favor of hearing parents having cochlear implants for these children. Because this deaf culture, while it's very beautiful, is a culture that the parents mostly won't be able fully to enter. And membership in the deaf culture is something which would exclude, to some degree, the families, and communication between parents and children, which is at the center of the parent-child relationship, may remain extremely difficult for children who are deaf and whose parents are hearing and who are effectively operating in different languages. So I was very interested in this tension between the cultural model and the illness model, and I was interested in how it played out in families and in how difficult the choices were these families had to make. And then a few years after I wrote the piece for the Times, and I said, when I wrote that piece, I said the situation has a lot in common with the situation of gay people. Gay people also have to go through this process of integrating themselves into a culture that's alien to their parents. Gay people also have parents who tend to see their condition as an illness historically, and certainly as a disadvantage at the very least. And those parents often really want to kind of pull their children back into the fold. And then a friend of mine had a child who was a dwarf, and it turns out that most dwarfs are born to parents of average height. And this friend began saying, I'm just trying to decide, should I tell her she's just like everyone else, only she's a little bit shorter, or should I try to get involved in this world of dwarfs and join the little people of America? What should the approach be that I take with this child who is a dwarf? And as she looked at these questions of to what extent effectively to bring her child up within her own culture, and to what extent effectively to integrate her child into another culture, as she looked at those questions, I thought, here it is again. It's the same set of questions. Now, within the field of dwarfism, there is actually, just announced in the last few weeks, the possibility of pharmaceutical interventions that may affect the development of people with the gene for chondroplasia. But there has been historically the matter of limb lengthening, which is a process that seems to me to be brutal and sadistic, though I have met people who've had it and who are very glad to have it. It's a process in which the bones, first of the lower leg, are broken in many places, screws are inserted through the leg. As the bones begin to knit together, the screws are tightened and they're pulled apart again, and effectively the bone keeps trying to heal and being pulled apart and trying to heal and being pulled apart. And the ultimate result of that treatment may be a gain of as much as 13 inches in height, which is the difference between being aberrant and being merely a relatively short person within the spectrum of normal. And limb lengthening struck me as brutal and highly problematical. But I had to recognize, and I do recognize, that while the cochlear implant had come to seem to me to be probably something I would do, and limb lengthening struck me as something I wouldn't do, that these definitions are all very fluid, and what I would or wouldn't have done 10 years ago is probably different, and what people would or wouldn't do 25 years from now is certainly different. And I knew that my own parents, had they realized that I was gay early on and been told that there was a small surgical intervention they could take to change that, would have opted for it. And I think when I look at that possibility of my own culture or any other culture being eliminated, I have to balance the two disparate needs, one of which is that you want to spare individuals suffering or pain or difficulty. I would like to spare my own children suffering, pain, and difficulty. And at the same time, I think it's a better world for being a rich and various world. And if we eliminate various kinds of difference and diversity, we are damaging the world. So much as species diversity is necessary for the health of the planet, so this diversity of experience and identity is, I think, also necessary to strengthen the ecosphere of kindness. And how does one deal with that apparent conflict?
So I want to return in a few minutes to one of the most striking issues that came up in the background of what you were saying, which is that in almost all the cases you described, the intervention that would be required to produce a kind of typicality in the adult person is an intervention that needs to happen very, very early in that person's life. That is, it's an intervention, the decision with respect to which needs to be made by parents on behalf of the child. And given what you've described about vertical and horizontal identities, it's a decision that is almost always made by an individual who is not yet, and perhaps will not ever be, fully immersed in the alternate community. And I want to talk about that at the end of our conversation in the context of some of the other cases you described, transgender and so on. But before we get there, I want to ask you to say a bit about what I see as the less paradigmatic cases that nonetheless share in some sense the structure you've identified in the case of deafness and dwarfism, but in other ways not so clearly. So, for example, in the book, you also discuss the cases of schizophrenia, which is an identity that in the end, I think, doesn't seem to you so subject naturally to the kind of perhaps appropriate valorization that deafness and dwarfism are. That is, it's an identity where the problematic features associated seem, even when one becomes immersed within the community, to be sufficiently great that it's a challenging identity to embrace. And I wondered if you could say a few words about why it is that you thought that nonetheless this horizontal vertical theory was a helpful way of thinking about that, and why including schizophrenia, for example, in a book that was primarily about valorizable identities was a useful thing to do.
There are a few pieces to look at in response to that, but I think the first is to say that the book is not necessarily about valorizable identities. The book is about identities, and part of the point in the book, I mean, I look, for example, at crime. I don't think that crime is a valorizable identity. I do think, however, that the experience of many people who commit crimes is that their criminality constitutes an identity, and that we're naive if we don't look at crime and consider that aspect of the question. So I think it's important for us to look at what identity is in a neutral way and say there are many kinds of identity. They become very central to how somebody lives his life. Some of them are essentially positive, some of them are essentially negative. Most of them combine positive and negative elements. And I wanted to look at that full spectrum. You know, I don't think being a child of rape is particularly an identity that needs to be valorized, but I think if we're able to look at the experience either of being the parent of such a child or of being such a child, then we're able to respond to the situation with more empathy, with more insight, and with a more profound sense of what the challenges are that are involved in negotiating the condition and in ameliorating it. So I begin with that as a sort of background point. Schizophrenia was of interest to me for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it essentially is something that sets in relatively late in life. Most people who develop schizophrenia develop it in late adolescence or sometime in their 20s, occasionally even later. There's been a movement within, for example, the field of autism rights, which is a very vital movement that we may talk about later in the conversation, to say that autism is so fundamental to somebody's experience of himself and of the world that when you try to imagine someone with autism without autism, you are effectively imagining another person. And that struck a chord for me because when people say to me, well, what do you think you'd be like if you weren't gay? I feel like, well, I would be somebody else. I might be quite a happy somebody else, who knows? Perhaps I'd be a stockbroker living in Connecticut and having the time of my life, but I wouldn't be me because who I am has been so profoundly defined by my sense of difference. People within the autism rights movement feel this so strongly that one activist actually said that if you are trying to imagine me without autism and if you are hoping that I will be cured, what you're really hoping is that someday I will cease to exist and a stranger you can love will move in behind my face. Now, if you're dealing with schizophrenia, neither the parent nor the person who has schizophrenia, in imagining that person without schizophrenia, is imagining an unknowable and unimaginable abstraction. Instead, what they're contemplating is exactly who they were for the first 18 or 20 or 27 years of their life. They're imagining who they were up until the schizophrenia set in. And I wanted to look at the way in which that provides a very profoundly different set of experiences within an identity than anything else does. There are people who have schizophrenia who manage to get it really well under control and lead positive, good, fulfilling lives. There are people who have schizophrenia who are able to, who are not able to get all of the symptoms under control, but who nonetheless find some measure of meaning in their experience of psychosis. But I found, by and large, that while there are people within the autism rights movement who would say, autism has provided something glorious to the world that wouldn't exist without it, and if you eliminated all of us, you would effectively eliminate various kinds of mathematical and technical thinking. There are deaf people who've said the deaf culture is amazing and beautiful, and I was convinced as I went into it that the world that exists around sign language is a powerful and potent world. There are transgender people who feel that by constantly questioning the oppressive nature of a conventional gender binary, they're actually making it a more open world for everyone. My experience in dealing with people with schizophrenia is that essentially very few of them have said, I'm completely thrilled that I have this condition and would never want a life without it. Most of them said, this condition has made my life terribly hard, and for most of them, if you could resolve it entirely, they would be happy to go back to being the person they had been prior to its onset.
So I was really moved throughout the book by the compassion and empathy with which you were able to listen to people who had found meaning in identities which are often denigrated in society. And I recognize the corrective that you made, which is that the book is not merely about valorized identities, schizophrenia being one, that even those who take that identity as central to themselves view as problematic. But there's an interesting contrast case which you discuss only briefly in passing in the opening chapter, which is the cases of the pro-Mia and pro-Anna movements. These are individuals with anorexia and bulimia who have, at least to some extent through the internet and perhaps through other sorts of groups, organized in a way that they take the rhetoric that has come to be available as the result of movements like the neurodiversity movement, which celebrates thinking about the world from an autistic perspective, or the deaf rights community, or the rights communities associated with various other disability, what are typically perceived as disability statuses, and applied them to a case where you find yourself unwilling to go along with them. And I wonder whether you have anything that you've come up with that can serve as either a principle or a first cut approximation of why it is that the pro-Mia and pro-Anna movements don't strike you as having latched onto something deeply helpful in understanding human experience where their analogs in other cases have.
Well, I think the most obvious response is that anorexia and bulimia are illnesses from which people often die. In fact, they have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. And I think, therefore, that the people who are in the pro-Anna and pro-Mia movements, who are saying this is just the way that we choose to be, and they exchange tips on so-called thinspiration and ways of achieving extreme weight loss, actually end up with blood on their hands because people are dying from these syndromes. So I think it's simply that those people are actually leading a lot of other people on a path toward death. I mean, you can say that people who are celebrating autism are perhaps leading people in a direction that much of society sees as problematical, but there are two key points. One is that while there are treatments that ameliorate some manifestations of autism, autism is not actually treatable or curable, and therefore if you have it, you need to come up with some intact sense of identity that acknowledges the condition. And two is that you don't die of autism. It may make your life difficult in some ways. It may exalt your life in some ways. There's room for debate on that question, but you don't die from it. So anorexia and bulimia seem to me to be essentially conditions that are often fatal, and I feel that encouraging people in that direction seems murderous to me. But I have to again acknowledge that while I do feel that very strongly, that if we go back, I mean, in 1969, I think it was, Time magazine ran an article, Time Magazine, the voice of the relatively moderate mainstream, that said about gayness that it was a pitiable second-rate flight from reality that deserves no glamorization as anything but a pernicious sickness. And so our sense of what's a sickness and what's not a sickness changes. I don't see how it can change in relationship to bulimia and anorexia because of the mortality that's associated with them. But I do recognize that it's a subject that's in constant flux, and that's saying this is definitely an illness, and this is definitely not an illness, and this is a valid identity, and this is not a valid identity, is always a dubious undertaking. My purpose in the book is not so much to sort everything out and say these are the valid identities and these are the invalid ones, as to say these are fluid categories, and in assessing some identities as valid and others as invalid, we have to acknowledge that what will seem valid and invalid in 50 years may be completely different, and we should look at how much flexibility there is there.
One of the things that's most impressive about the book is something that you say methodologically right at the beginning, which is that you make use of statistics where statistics help us to understand the conditions, but that primarily this is a non-reductive enterprise. This is a book that is gaining much of its power through narrative. It's a book of stories and storytelling. And it's a book that actually involved lived experience on your part. Story after story in the book makes it clear that you spent a week, 2 weeks living with a family and undergoing in that context some of the experiences that they had. And one of the things that's been missing from our conversation so far is any sense of the richness of the description of the book. And I wonder whether, with regard to any one of the three identities that we've touched on so far, either deafness or dwarfism or schizophrenia, you wanted very briefly to give a sense of what kind of experiences you had in the course of researching the book and what sorts of individuals you encountered in that process.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. It is a book of stories in the end, and my argument is that contrary to the sort of common assumption of our information age, that frequently there are profound truths that come out of stories that don't come out of statistics, and that statistics in all of these areas are necessarily reductive because they involve rating people on scales, and those scales are not true to lived experience in the way that stories are. Just not to say that statistics aren't enormously useful, just to say that they aren't necessarily the most revealing way to look at some of the issues that I'm examining. So I could spend the next hour and a half telling stories from the book, or indeed the next week doing so, but I'll tell you the story, which I think is kind of a telling one for some of the questions we've just been discussing, of Clinton Brown, who was someone I got to know. He was born with a condition called diastrophic dwarfism. When he was born, the doctors told his parents that he was never going to learn to walk. He was unlikely ever even to recognize them, that he was so disabled that they should really just give him up for care and go home without him. And his parents said that they were unwilling to do that, and they took him home with them. His mother worked in a telephone call center. His father worked in construction. Neither of them had enormous educational or economic advantages. Nonetheless, in a pre-internet period in the late 80s, his mother managed to find the leading doctor in the country for dealing with diastrophic dwarfism, who was at Johns Hopkins. She took Clinton there, and in the course of the first 10 years of his life, he had 30 major surgical interventions, which were designed at helping him to be able to walk. And so he spent a large chunk of his childhood in hospitals. And while he was there, he thought, well, there's nothing else very much to do here, so I might as well learn to do some of the schoolwork that's being assigned to me. And so he began learning how to do various academic work. He did incredibly well with it. He became the first person in his family to go to college. And his mother said to me, and I remember this as such a sort of poignant conversation, and I spoke to her one day. They lived on Long Island. He was going to Hofstra, which was not very far away. He was loving being in college. His mother had been out doing some chores and errands, and she was driving home. And Clinton, who was less than 3 feet tall, had a had a car that was specially fitted for him to drive. And as she was driving along, she saw it parked outside of a bar. She said, and I just thought to myself, he's 3 feet tall. His friends are 6 feet tall. 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. There's the car. He's going to have too much to drink, and he's going to get in that car, and is he going to crash the car? And she said, I wanted to just go into the bar and find out what was happening, but I knew, of course, that I couldn't do that. So I went home and I left him all these messages on his cell phone. And then I thought to myself, if someone had told me when he was born that my future problem would be that he was going to go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I would have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, well, what do you think you did that helped him to turn into such a remarkable, accomplished, and extremely charismatic person? And she said, what did I do? She said, I loved him, that's all. And then she described how he had been in Manhattan, and he came home and he said, I saw this blind man in the subway and he seemed to be lost, and I felt so sorry for him. Everyone was rushing by, he said, and so I helped him to find his way to the place where he was going. And I just thought, gee, people aren't helping him at all. And she said to me, in describing that empathetic, kind, generous thing that someone who has difficulty with his own locomotion had engaged in helping this person, she said, Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. And I think there was a sense that in his accomplishments academically and in his accomplishments of empathy, that he had turned into this extraordinary person. And I think the family would have said if he hadn't had the disability he had, he might not have become extraordinary in those ways, that he had managed to take the occasion of the difficulty he was confronting and use it as the basis for a development both intellectually and emotionally, and that was a very profound and meaningful transformation.
So one of the things that story brings out is the way in which the presence of what we can call a horizontally identified child in a family forces two kinds of realizations. One of which is a recognition that there's a kind of value in a previously unfamiliar sort of existence. And this is the sort of strand of valorization that I had been picking up on earlier that's part of many of these identities. And the second is that simultaneously it introduces a kind of compassion for the ways in which the world may be structured so as to make certain kinds of conditions impediments to full integration in the world, so that there's simultaneously a way in which it increases one's ability to see how difference can be, even in the world as it's structured, enriching, and that it increases one's ability to see the ways in which those differences can be challenging. And one of the things that struck me is that part of the force of the narrative structure of the book is that it is many experiences for the reader, that in the same way that the lived experiences of the individuals you describe give them this lesson, the narrative experiences that you offer give a sort of milder version of that. And one of the things that you mention in passing is the extent to which there's been at least some movement in the domain of the mainstream media of representing in non-stereotyped ways individuals who were previously associated only with disability. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the ways in which anything from Modern Family's recognition of the ways in which families take different shapes to Game of Thrones' recognition of the ways in which bodies take different shapes have played in some moderate sense the role that your storytelling does of giving us access to these lessons of lived experience.
So I perhaps should begin with the caution that because I've been rather occupied with writing this book as well as having small children, I haven't seen all of those representations as much as I perhaps should. But there's no question that there has been a real shift in the way that difference is represented in the media. And I think I'd begin by going back a long way before Game of Thrones and Modern Family and say that when the filmmakers who made One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was the film that for many years defined popular perceptions of schizophrenia in the United States, when they were making that film, they had the option to use the patients at the hospital where it was being filmed as the extras in the movie. And the directors said, no, they don't look enough like crazy people. They don't seem crazy enough. We need to have actors who can portray the way that people understand crazy people to be. And so the perception of schizophrenia that was being created was never even intended to be an accurate representation of what people with schizophrenia looked like. It was intended to theatricalize and exaggerate the difference of such people. Now we live in a time in which there is much more openness to exposing the reality of people who are different. Now, my limited exposure suggests to me that Modern Family and Game of Thrones also trade in plenty of cliches, and that they aren't necessarily really true to the experience of the people I've talked to. What they do achieve, however, is for people no longer to look at people who are different in these particular ways as being nearly as aberrant as they must once have seemed. And there is a movement toward understanding the essential humanity of people who are different. And it's made an enormous difference in terms of how people in general will respond to situations. I mean, I'm gay, I have kids, I'm constantly having people say, oh my God, you're like a real-life Modern Family. But it gives a cultural reference point, as opposed to having people say, oh my God, I've never heard of anything like what you're talking about. And the case in which I think the transformation has been most striking and perhaps most dramatic, and it's a story that fits into the book, is in the representation of people with Down syndrome. So Emily Pearl Kingsley, who was a writer for Sesame Street, described the intense loneliness she experienced when her child was born, Jason, and she was told that he had Down syndrome, and how in those first weeks she said, I turned on the television and suddenly nobody looked like me. And in an attempt to turn that around, she said to the people at Sesame Street that she wanted her son to be on the program so that people would have seen a child with Down syndrome, so that a child with Down syndrome wouldn't look as anomalous as such children had previously looked. And indeed, Jason was on the program. Jason went on to write a book and to have kind of a public career as a person with Down syndrome. And when the show Life Goes On was on television, it had a central character with Down syndrome, and it gave a reasonably accurate depiction of what life might be like for someone with Down syndrome, and represented someone who had the limitations of the condition, but who was also relatively high functioning, rather than showing only the most extreme, the darkest, the most ludicrous side of any given condition. I think the presence of such people in the popular media made a huge difference, and when I was interviewing a young woman who has Down syndrome, she introduced herself by saying, I have Down syndrome, like the character on the show Life Goes On. And she had something with which to identify herself, which was not negative, which was not a show about terrible disease and ghastly things that happen. It was a show that was exalting the experience of people who had her condition in some regard, or if not exalting it, at least acknowledging the validity and the power and the positive aspects of that condition. And so I think that those representations really, they make us less uncomfortable. If you've been exposed to something enough, and you've seen the genuine humanity that lives within it, it's harder then to hate it and to disparage it. You know, in the same way that Harvey Milk famously said about gay people that the best activist thing you can do is to go and tell people who you are. If enough people have met enough people who have the condition that you have, or who have the syndrome or situation or even illness that you have, who have whatever it is that you have, if enough people have seen it, and if it's been normalized enough for them, it becomes much harder to treat people who have it as a category and to subject them either to the kind of vicious hatred that there's been against some of the groups in the book, or simply against the lack of sympathy, the lack of empathy, the lack of understanding that there's been for many of the other conditions in the book. So that, I think, is really where we're making progress, and that's where I think every one of these television programs, whether it's a fantastic program or actually not such a great program artistically, if they're causing us to have a society in which these various norms are treated differently, it's progress. And if people see these things and become adjusted to them, they will be better informed and less prejudiced in their interactions with individuals who have these conditions whom they encounter.
And of course, this recognition of the power of narrative to transform both self-understanding and a sense of normalcy is one of the central themes of Plato's Republic. Plato is afraid of the artists and wants to ban what he sees as misrepresentations from the ideal city, exactly because he recognizes the power of narrative structure and of a normalization of behavior in presentation and narrative structure to affect self-understanding. And I think just with regard to the methodology of the book, the process of storytelling over and over again with an introduction of familiarity before there's an introduction of unfamiliarity. That is, each of the stories begins with the description of something which will feel common to almost any reader because it describes a human condition of loving or seeking or loneliness that is universal, and then introduced into that familiar comes something which will, for many readers of the book, feel unfamiliar. So picking up on that theme, I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which recognizing that there are others like oneself, that is, others who differ from the typical in the ways that oneself does, and that there's a term or label that can describe that, and a kind of systematic framework for making sense of it is enormously valuable. And it's clear how that plays itself out in the case of some of the identities you've described so far. The Asperger's community very much depends upon self-understanding through the existence of others who share a similar perspective on the world. But one of the cases where I think that's most striking is in the case of transgender. And as I mentioned to you in our previous conversation, I'm a parent to a gender non-conforming child. I have a child who is biologically male, but who, since he was about 2 years old, has lived with a self-presentation that would be recognized in any community as female, though I'm lucky enough to live in a place that thus far he's been comfortable with his birth pronoun and his female self-presentation. There's decisions that we'll need to make in adolescence, and I want to talk about that in a few minutes. But for us, probably the most important thing has been getting to know other families who have children whose gender self-presentation and biological identity come apart. And that's been incredibly valuable both for our child and for us. And I wondered if you could say a bit about other cases where you've seen that experience.
Other cases where I've seen the child's identity.
Where you've other cases where the fact that there is an identity group available for somebody has allowed a kind of comfort with a way of being that just wouldn't be available without the sense that there is a community of others who share this way of being in the world.
In some sense, the purpose of the book, if I'm to reduce it to a single purpose, is to identify the general issue of identity and to examine the ways in which difference altogether becomes central to people's identity in ways that are consistent across various kinds of difference. So I am not saying that the experience of someone who's a dwarf and the experience of a gender non-conforming child and the experience of a criminal are identical, nor even that the experiences of their families are identical. The reason the book has a number of chapters that go in depth into each situation is because I want to examine the particularities associated with each of these kinds of difference. But the point that I would attempt to make is that most families are dealing with some measure of difference in some regard or in some degree. And as families struggle with their own experience of difference, they tend to feel isolated. There aren't so many people who are dealing with schizophrenia. There aren't so many people who are dealing with crime. There aren't so many people with gender variant children. If, on the other hand, one acknowledges that there are certain things that all of these people have in common, that there are ways in which the gender non-conforming child and the child with schizophrenia and the child with Down syndrome or autism or dwarfism or deafness, if one acknowledges that there are ways in which the process of having an identity which tends to be stigmatized, of having a difference from the parents, which the parents may find traumatic, if one identifies that all of those things are actually related, then suddenly people find themselves not in the lonely little minority of people who have schizophrenia, for example, but rather in this wonderful, sweeping, large swath of the population that is dealing with difference of some kind. And difference of some kind is ubiquitous. I have yet to meet any parent who has not at some stage looked at their child and thought, where did you come from and why are you like that? You know, there's always the sense that difference is being negotiated within families. And I think that a lot of the time, the experiences people have of being marginal are enormously mitigated if they can find a community of people with like experience. And the purpose in writing the book is in a way to say, if you have a child who's gender non-conforming, here is a larger community of people who have the same experience of a non-conforming child and with whom you have something in common. And here is a larger world in which everyone has children who are in some measure alien or foreign or strange or difficult to deal with. How is it that one is ultimately able to deal with that whole larger world? What is the thing that you have in common, not with a small minority of people, but in fact with the bulk of humanity? Does that answer your question? I may have lost the thread.
No, in fact, I think that answers the question beautifully and really brings out one of the many things that's so powerful about the book, which is that at the same time that it is a book very deeply about the specificity of each of these experiences, it's also a book that, through laying out these specificities over and over again, makes one aware of the commonalities of the experiences. So we have only a few minutes, and in part because I have a particular interest in the case, to talk in the closing segment just a little bit more about the issue of transgender. And I realize this is something with which both you and I are more familiar than the typical listener is likely to be. And so I wonder whether you could tell very quickly one or two stories of the kind that you do in that chapter. And then we could talk a little bit more generally about the issues.
When I set out to write a chapter about families of people who are transgender, I thought that I was writing about a subject that was of some abstract interest and to which I had no more connection than I did to stories about people who have autism or Down syndrome or multiple severe disabilities. I felt that I had no greater intimacy with or connection to it than to anything else. And then as I began working on the chapter and looking at the almost inconceivable intensity of prejudice to which people who are transgender are subject, I found myself deeply sympathetic with them because I was terribly bullied as a child, as lots of gay people were. And when I think about that bullying, what I come to is that I wasn't being bullied initially for my sexuality, because I started being bullied when I was 5 years old, and sexuality hadn't even crossed my mind yet. What I was being bullied for were the ways in which I myself was gender non-conforming, the ways in which I fell short of some ideal of masculinity. I was not transgender, I'm not transgender, but I was not, I wasn't good at sports, and I wasn't sort of the kind of guy's guy that was popular when I was a child in elementary school, and that to a sort of shocking degree, given how much the world is supposed to have changed, a norm that continues, I think, to oppress children who are of elementary school age, and indeed many people who are older than that. So I ended up having a deep sense of sympathy with these stories that went beyond what I had with the stories in most of the other chapters, because it felt so intimate and personal to me. And what I found in looking at people who are transgender was that there was an unbelievably broad range of response. The thing that was most startling to me was the degree of outrage and anger and prejudice that trans people provoke, given that trans people really aren't causing much damage to anybody else, but the number of trans people who are murdered is absolutely stupefying. Trans people are murdered every month in the United States. Some of them are murdered. If you look at the experience of trans people, the number of them who have been physically abused and sexually abused and fired from their jobs is enormous. Trans people, on average, are in a completely social demographic from the one in which their siblings, who presumably have the same socioeconomic opportunities, are situated because of all of the prejudice they've had to negotiate. So I'll tell you two stories that to me represent, in a way, the kind of two ends of a spectrum. One is the story of someone whom I've called Anne MacDonald in the book, and who was a teacher working in the special needs education sector in a small town in Tennessee. She had a child who was brought in and put in her special needs class, and she had taken care of all the special needs children in this district and had thought that she was beloved there. This child came in who had no language and who had very extreme behavior. Turned out the child had been the child of a mother who, instead of taking the antipsychotics that had been prescribed to her, fed them to her children to sedate them and kept them tied to a pole in her house. And the children were unbelievably disturbed. Anne began working with this child who'd been put in her classroom. She gradually got him to function better and better. She then discovered that he and his siblings were going to be separated because they were going into the foster care system and no one would take all three of them because they all had so many problems. She agreed to adopt all three children. She had to move to a different district in order to adopt them because of some issues of adoption law. Took on these three children, brought them all out of their dysfunction, got them all into the regular education system and out of the special education system. And then when one of them, the youngest one, was 7 or 8 years old, the child had kept saying, "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, I'm really a girl, don't you understand, I'm really a girl?" And finally she decided, I'm going to let this child live as who she believes herself to be. And so she went into her school and she said, in the fall, it was summertime, she said, in the fall, my child Kerry is going to come back as a girl named Kelly. And I hope that you'll be able to accept her when she comes here, and these are the arrangements I'd like to make to facilitate her experience. And she said within an hour, the phone calls began. There were voices she didn't even recognize. Some of them said they were going to kill her child. Some of them said they were going to kill her. Some of them said they were going to make her child into the woman he wants to be. There were these unbelievable attacks, and she was stupefied. She said, I thought I was loved in this town. And I thought if I'd said what my child needed, that there would be a response of support for what my child needed. She was 8 years old. She was the smallest child in her class. And she said she went on in this experience, and finally her pediatrician telephoned her and said, if you don't get out of town before this weekend, there are people who are going to murder you and your child. And so she packed up a van with all of her belongings, and she took all three of her children, and she drove off to another city, where she moved into a trailer park because she didn't want anyone in the new city to be in touch with anyone in the old city, and she felt as long as that was the case, she wouldn't be able to provide any credentials as a teacher and wouldn't be able to get a job. And so she was there mopping the floors of restaurants, trying to take care of these three children. Her husband stayed behind so that he would have the economic wherewithal to support the family, and the next day he went to work, and when he came home, the family dog had been disemboweled and nailed to the fence with the suggestion that the child was next. And the degree of anger and hatred was so stupefying, but when I talked to her about it, I said to her, you know, this has been so awful, and where are you with all of it? And she said, I'm full of sadness for the things I left behind. She said, my daddy's grave is back there, and I have to hope someone else is putting flowers on it. I'll never see it again. I'll never see my mother. I'll never see my sister. I'll never see the church I went to all my life. She said, but I have a happy child. And when she gets off that school bus this afternoon and you see her rushing toward me with her arms open, you'll see that smile on her face. And it was a happiness she never had before. And there's nothing I've given up that isn't worth that. And in the end, she was able to lead me into a bigger world, the world in which I've met you. And I have to say, I'm grateful for it, and that if I had it to do over again, it would never occur to me not to adopt her. And that story of the depth of maternal love that someone achieved, in this case for adopted children, and for this child in particular, seemed so vivid to me that she really gave up her entire life for that child's happiness. Now, at the other end, and it's striking to me as a bookending story because it's also one that is involved in Christianity, Christianity having been the narrative through which the people who wanted to murder her child kept telling her that her child was against the will of Christ and what she was doing was evil and wrong, and hadn't she read the Bible? I got to know someone named Kim Reed, who's a very accomplished filmmaker who came from Helena, Montana, and who had been, when she was a man named Paul, the quarterback on her high school football team, and who then went on and is now living as a lesbian in Lower Manhattan. And she did an amazing film, which was about her experience of going back to Helena, and which in part covered her 25th high school reunion, and which had, for me, the kind of high point of the film is when she's sitting on a sofa and one of the other people from her class comes over and says, "Kim, we've all changed." And Kim called me rather excitedly one day and said, "I've had a call from the pastor at the church where I grew up, and he wants to have a special weekend when I come home, and he's going to show the film on Friday, and on Saturday have seminars to discuss its content, and on Sunday has invited me to give the sermon at church." And I went, and the film was shown on Friday, and I sat with Kim's mother, who had to deal with all of this within her community, but who was incredibly proud of Kim's accomplishment in making the film. And at the end of the film, Kim got a standing ovation, and then her mother came up, and her mother got a standing ovation. And on Sunday, Kim preached this beautiful sermon in which she talked in part about the idea that the film she'd shown included footage of herself as Paul in her high school football games. And she said, as the film was showing here, the high school football game was going on across town, and when I stood outside the church, I could hear the waft of sound coming through. And those recording their new memories to tape should be only so lucky as to have a child who surprises them by being the last thing they ever would have expected and being able to love that child anyway. And I said to Carol, Kim's mom, afterwards, I said, "Do you wish Paul had been happy to be Paul?" And she said, "Well, of course I do. It would have been easier for everyone. But the key phrase in that is happy to be Paul. He wasn't, and I can't imagine the courage it took. Paul wasn't fully present because he was distracted by this other thing. And now look what we've got, Kim, and the radiant pride that she had in who her daughter had become, and the sense that this community, in this case, interestingly, also organized within a church, had so welcomed back this person, seemed to me to be the antithesis of the story of Anne MacDonald and to represent the variety of what's possible within humanity and indeed within religion in terms of either stigmatizing or celebrating and accepting difference. And when I said to Kim, "Why do you think your experience was so different?" She said, "I don't really know," she said, "but I think it's because of who my parents had been in this community." And I said to Carol, "What do you think?" And she said, "I would like to think it's because of the way we had lived our lives and the relationships we had forged." So it's a message of great hope.
One of the things that's been most palpable to me through my own involvement as a parent in the community of parents of gender non-conforming children is the incredible diversity that the community represents. I'd often assumed that it would simply be liberal, educated, otherwise left-wing parents who were supportive of this incredibly deep feature about their children. But one of the things that's been most astounding is that we've met parents from a huge range of faith communities, parents from the Mormon community, parents from various fundamentalist Christian religions, who understand their child's experience through a framework according to which God doesn't make mistakes and God made their child in this particular way. And that, in some ways, has been enormously helpful for those of us in the community who lack a faith tradition for making sense of our experiences. And so for me, it's been eye-opening, not only because my child is very different from me, but also because I've come to know parents of a sort that I would never otherwise have had the chance to meet.
Yes.
So perhaps on that positive note, we should end our formal public conversation because we're coming up on the hour mark. And I'd like to let you have any last words that you might want to offer.
I think by way of last words, I would say only this, that identity is a fluid category, that illness is a fluid category, that how we define one or the other varies, that I described what Time magazine had said about being gay when I was a child, this idea of it as a pernicious sickness, and that I decided while I was working on this book to have children of my own. And there were many people who said to me, how can you possibly want to have children of your own in the middle of doing this book about everything that can go wrong? And I said, I've decided I want to have children of my own because for me this is a book about how even when everything goes wrong, as it were, still the parents manage to find enormous love for and enormous connection to their children. And that really, for me, is the dominant and the primary theme of the book, is the resilience and the flexibility and the profundity of parental love and attachment. And in discovering that, I discovered the experience of family myself. I thought if all of these people could love all of these children, then I think I'll be able to love whatever children I have. And I sometimes think if someone had shown me when I was kind of younger and tortured a day in my current life with a husband, with children, able to go out into the world and spend time with a family that I gained so much pleasure from, I wouldn't have believed it was possible, but it would have spared me so many years of self-torture and so many years of uncertainty and discontent and anguish. When I was a little child, my mother used to say to me, the love for your children is unlike any other emotion. It's the most beautiful feeling in the world. And when she said it, I would think to myself, wow, what a compliment to me. And when I was an adolescent, she would say the same thing. And I would think to myself, but I don't think I'm going to be able to have children. And the same statement that had once made me feel so proud made me anxious. And when I came out of the closet, and she said that to me, it made me furious. And I would say, I'm gay and I'm not going to have children, and stop saying that. But in the end, actually, I did have children. And it turned out that she's right. And it's been such a fulfillment and such a joy. My husband and I, between us, have 4 children. They, of course, sometimes are infuriating and frustrating and insane in the way that everyone's children are. But that experience has been such a joyful one, and I feel change has been good to me and has allowed me to have these experiences I didn't think I would have. And I almost see this book as having the moral purpose of helping to strengthen change altogether. And I hope give other people who felt, as I did when I was growing up, that they were on the path to despair, to find, as I have in some measure as an adult, a kind of happiness that once seemed impossible.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking the time to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for taking the time for it. It's been a pleasure.